Welcome back to Module 1, Inventing Ohio. Our goal in Module 1 is to discover an unfamiliar Ohio, even if that means discussing people who never called themselves Ohioans and a place that was not yet called Ohio. As in Lecture 1, Lecture 2 focuses on technology, specifically, how technological change builds and destroys communities. Keep in mind as well that Native Americans are often depicted as simple people living in an Eden, gently working the land, innocent of the impact of technology, living unchanged lives century after century, millennia after millennia. After viewing lectures 1 and 2, how well does that stereotype hold up? So what happened to the Hopewell culture? If we look at the three things that they did well, technology, exchange, and religion, we see that around 400 or 500 AD, something changed. For example, mound building declined. The exchange network deteriorated as well, and the ceremonies subsided. In other words, it's clear that pilgrims stopped coming to the place we call Ohio. They stopped seeking out that transformative scientific religious experience that the Newark earthworks offered. And we see as well an entirely new culture emerge in the place that we call Ohio by 1000 AD. We call this culture the Fort Ancient culture, though as with the Hopewell, we have no idea what they really called themselves. It's interesting to note that this new culture had no genetic links to the Hopewell or their ancestors. In other words, the Hopewell could link themselves to people in this region dating back several thousand years. But by 1000 AD, the people of the Hopewell culture had disappeared. We don't know what happened to them. This also means that the people of the Fort Ancient culture were probably newcomers to this place, that they moved to this place from somewhere else. Some speculate, and it's quite possible, that the Fort Ancient culture were the ancestors of the Shawnee Indians. So what happened to the people of the Hopewell culture? We don't know. We can, however, look at the evidence and see that their culture was undermined, was made obsolete by technological change. I'm talking specifically about the bow and arrow, which first appeared in the place that we call Ohio around 300 to 500 AD. Now, this technology was not invented by anyone in the Hopewell culture, but it did diffuse through their interaction sphere, the system of exchange that they created. And it replaced the atlatl, which was a stick designed to throw a spear or a dart. There were consequences to this technological change. First, it turned individuals into more efficient killers. Second, it undermined the need for a social or communal hunt involving large, diverse groups. And so by 1000 AD, in the place that we call Ohio, we see several developments. People lived in larger, more sedentary communities than they did in the past. Well-armed groups occupied and defended resource sites that were once open access. Intergroup violence increased, that is, skeletal remains show more and more bashed-in skulls, more and more bones broken by sharp arrow points. And we see defensive structures surrounding communities, that is, palisades or walls being built. Clearly, technological change contributed to social reorganization. This social reorganization contributed to conflicting pressures. For example, there was the pressure of population growth. These people were feeding themselves just well enough to grow, but growing too much to sustain that growth. And that meant that there was a pressure also of reduced access to resources. After all, every small group was well armed. Every small group defended their territory. That meant that there was a general desire to avoid conflict, which translated into the pressure to do more with less. That is, to grow more crops on fewer acres. So with more mouths to feed and far fewer resources with which to feed them, the Fort Ancient culture people had a problem. And they turned to food technology as a solution. And by food technology, I mean corn. We're so used to thinking of corn as a natural food, we forget that it is actually a product of scientific experimentation. It is, in fact, the hybridization of several humanly indigestible grasses. The first edible varieties appeared in Mexico around 5000 BC. And around 8 or 900 AD, corn became an important part of the diet for the first time in the place that we call Ohio. Let's be clear about what the Fort Ancient Culture people did. They chose imported food technology over locally sourced natural food. Why? Because it improved crop yields. This choice had consequences. For example, corn is nutritionally weak. It's especially low in a vitamin called niacin. As a result, the Fort Ancient Culture people were smaller in stature than the people in the Hopewell culture. They were also less able to fend off infectious diseases. And they had more chronic diseases like arthritis and tooth decay or cavities. Overall, the Fort Ancient Culture people led shorter lives than the people under the Hopewell culture. So what should we make of these technological changes? One view might be that it led to a decline in health, and that it led to the loss of the interaction sphere, and that it meant that Native Americans in the place that we call Ohio faced new strangers, Europeans, in a weakened and fragmented state. The process I'm describing could be called de-skilling. Fixed field farming, especially one heavily focused on a single crop like corn, created new routines. Think, for example, of an assembly line in the 20th century. Workers stand in the same place hour after hour, day after day, year after year, and the product gets built one step at a time as it flows from worker to worker. Each worker performs the same task over and over, hour after hour, day after day, year after year. As increasingly sedentary farming becomes the norm, indigenous life contracted, that is, got smaller. Their knowledge of the wider world, their diet, their space, and even their ritual life all contracted. What happened to the skill of dealing with strangers? What happened to the skill of operating a monumental machine? What happened to the skill of trust, the very heart of the interaction sphere? These skills atrophied much as muscles do when not exercised. As a practical matter, here's what the contracting looked like. The Hopewell used a diverse range of subsistence strategies to feed themselves. They planted locally sourced crops, they hunted, they gathered. They were, as a result, flexible in case something drastic happened to one source of their food supply. The Fort Ancient, in contrast, narrowed the range of subsistence strategies, focusing a large part of the diet on corn. In terms of village life, the Hopewell lived along a continuum, ranging from mobile and dispersed communities to small sedentary villages. The Fort Ancient, however, increasingly relied on sedentary lives and bigger villages. Ceremonial rituals, active and vibrant under the Hopewell, declined under the Fort Ancient. And exchange networks, long distance and essential to spiritual life under the Hopewell, shortened and became less central to the community under the Fort Ancient. In light of that view, let's reconsider this artist's rendering of the Newark earthworks. In Lecture 1, we asked you to imagine it at its peak, to smell the communal feasts, to bear witness to the pilgrims bearing exotic goods from distant places, to feel the emotional, transformative rituals. We wanted you to see this as monumental machinery, as technology that produces both a material good and social meaning. Now imagine it as a once bustling place, now desolate. Imagine it as abandoned technology, as an obsolete way of thinking about and acting in the world. And reconsider this artist's rendering in light of this next picture. Now bear with me. The Youngstown Sheet and Tube Company. It too was a once bustling place, now desolate. It too, at its peak, was monumental machinery, technology that produced material good as well as social meaning. It helped organize a community around a common value and goal. But once new technology made this technology obsolete, The community that organized around it struggled as well. The Newark Earthworks, the Youngstown Sheet and Tube Company, they seem worlds apart. But are they? We can, of course, view technological change in a variety of ways. A second view might be that it led to more people and more food. That is, there were bigger, safer villages with more complex social organization, which means that the Ford Ancient Culture people had the technology and the social organization to be better fighters than the people of the Hopewell culture ever were. They could coercively suppress conflict in a way that the people of the Hopewell culture never could. This skill is important, especially when the Ford Ancient Culture faced a new group of strangers, Europeans, in the 17th century. Did it matter, however, how well you could fight if the most important weapon, the most devastating weapon that the Europeans deployed against you were germs? Germs that attacked already frayed social networks. That's the subject for the next lecture.